Thank you so much for coming. Now I'm just going to introduce our moderator for tonight, who we're really pleased to have. Give a big welcome to Rohan Kamicheril. He's a writer, editor, and chef, founder of the online food journal Tiffin. The website is basically like a guide to how to be a great food writer. He has a series of interviews, recipes, and stories of international travel. His food-oriented and journalistic writing has appeared in Gastronomica, The Margins, Hemispheres, Asymptote, and elsewhere. He was also the editor of Words Without Borders' literary anthology, The Wall in My Head, which commemorated the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Iron Curtain through written and visual work. And he's here tonight to moderate this incredible event. So give him a big round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm just so delighted to be here. I love the Asian American Writers Workshop and what they do. So thank you, Sophia. I'm really glad to see such an amazing crowd over here tonight. I think it's a real testament to the appeal of our fantastic panel, but also to the magnetism of food. Because the idea that food can tell a story or should tell a story isn't a new one. We see some version of this truism in almost every piece of food writing that gets published today. And yet, a lot of those pieces, many of these pieces are plainly nostalgic, gauzy, and they sort of deal in sort of platitudes about what food is about. Or even if they delve into the unpleasant, there's always the sense that food writing ought to act as a reparation of sorts. But because our appetites are so instinctual and so visceral, food also betrays our failings, our insecurities, and social inequities and indignities that we wish didn't exist but still do. And of course, joy, celebration, success, too. And food comfortably encompasses all of these awkward things together. And it can be a challenge to recreate or even to evoke that same mix successfully in writing. And which is why I'm so delighted to have this wonderful group of writers here today. Each addresses a unique way in which food, culture, and the imagination act upon each other. And I think you'll really be delighted to hear them speak today and to hear them read. So I'll step down and I'll introduce our first reader, which is Ligaya Mishan. Ligaya Mishan is the author of the Hungry City columns in the New York Times. Her weekly dispatches from restaurants around the city are essential and delectable reading for anyone looking to eat well in New York. The restaurants she covers are often smaller, owned and run by immigrants or the children of immigrants, and modestly priced. Her writing does what so little food writing manages, to evoke taste with brilliant and thoughtful lucidity, but also to remind the reader of all the things that go into taste: history, family, tradition. By invoking a living, ever-changing picture of how the city eats, she reminds us every week of the joys and rewards of the diversity that surrounds us in New York. In a recent piece, she described a mango shake as the kind of drink that turns your insides to gold, that makes you feel rich just to live in New York. The city, in turn, has been immeasurably enriched by her work in expanding the definition of what it means to eat well here. Please join me in welcoming Ligaya Mishan to the stage.
Thank you so much for that. I hope I can live up to that amazing introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to read a little bit from a piece that that ran in the New York Times' Tea magazine in the fall. That was about the ways in which Asian American chefs have changed the American palate. Any immigrant is an outsider at first, but for Asians in America, there is a starker sense of otherness. We don't fit into the American binary of white and black. We've been the enemy, the subjugated, the lesser peoples whose scramble for a foothold in society was historically seen as a menace to the American order. And yet we've also been the good immigrants, proving ourselves worthy of American beneficence, polite, humble, grateful, willing to work 20-hour days running a grocery store or a laundry or a restaurant that will never be authentic enough, to spend every dime on our children's test prep so they get into the best schools, because we believe in the promise of America that if you work hard, you can become anyone. If you try hard enough, you might even be mistaken for white. Among the children of immigrants, Asians in America seem most caught in a state of limbo, no longer beholden to their parents' countries of origin, but still grasping for a role in the American narrative. There is a unique foreignness that persists, despite the presence of Asians on American soil for more than 2 centuries. None of us, however bald our American accent, has gone through life without being asked, "Where are you from?" I mean originally. But while this can lead to alienation, it can also have a liberating effect. When you are raised in 2 cultures at once, when people see in you 2 heritages at odds, unresolved, in abeyance, you learn to shift at will between them. You may never feel like you quite belong in either, but neither are you fully constrained. The acute awareness of borders, culinary as well as cultural, that both enclose and exclude, allows paradoxically a claim to borderlessness, taking freely from both sides to forge something new. For Asian American chefs, this seesaw between the obligations of inheritance and the thrill of go-it-aloneness, between respecting your ancestors and lighting out for the hills, manifests in dishes that arguably could come only from minds fluent in 2 ways of life. Thus, the kaiseki at Nikki Nakayama's En-Naka in LA always includes a pasta course. Her slyly voluptuous carbonara of abalone livers and egg yolks is an homage to Tokyo-style wafu spaghetti with briny pickled cod roe, only here it's capped with shaved truffles. At Daoyuan in New Brunswick, Maine, the Chinese-American chef Kara Statler takes tiles of goat cheese made by a local creamery and sears them as is done in Yunnan. But instead of merely sprinkling the cheese with sugar or salt, she counters its meatiness with a bright grace note of mint and watermelon from Summer's Height. A Caesar salad, as re-envisioned by Chris Kajioka at Senya in Honolulu, might be a mossy cliff of charred cabbage, a wink at an iceberg wedge, dusted with shio kombu, soaked through with dashi and ginger, and surrounded by daubs of heady green goddess dressing and buttermilk turned to gel. It's not so much a salad as a cheeky biography of it by the barbarian at the gates, achieving the quintessence of an American classic through Asian ingredients. And while Asian American cooking may not be expressed in or identified by a single set of flavors, one thing that does unite such disparate traditions is an emphasis on textures. Indeed, if the cuisine can be said to have revolutionized American food, it's by introducing unfamiliar mouthfeels, crackle where one doesn't expect it, slime in a country that's always shied away from that sensation. Justin Yu of Theodore Rex in Houston rhapsodizes about the crunch that you can hear in the back of your head, unrendered, gelatinous animal skin, a fun burst of fat and softness, broths barely skimmed or with a spoonful of fat added to coat the lips. Katsuya Fukushima of Daikaya in Washington, D.C. once turned natto, a gooey, slippery skein of fermented soybeans with the perfume of cast-off socks, into an earthy caramel over soft serve. Like Latin American food, which made Americans crave heat, Asian American cuisine has made difficult textures not only desirable, but as integral to food as flavor itself. That certain ingredients still make some Western diners squeamish is part of the fun. But the question remains, does calling this kind of cooking Asian American cuisine deepen and contextualize our understanding of it? Or is it just a label, like speaking of Asian American art or fiction, a way of simplifying a complex story and making it a marketable cliche? The danger is fetishizing Asian features. White chefs are using these ingredients and saying, "Oh, it's so strange," Tin Vong of Little Sister in LA said. It isn't. At the same time, it seems reductive to expect Asian American chefs to make food that somehow reflects their personal story. On season 3 of Top Chef, Hung Hun, a Vietnamese American contestant, was faulted for cooking that was technically dazzling but lacked explicit reference to his roots. "You were born in Vietnam," Tom Colicchio, the head judge, said. "I don't see any of that in your food." It's hard not to hear an echo of the trope of the inscrutable Oriental, whose motives can't be deciphered, and the common criticism of Asian Americans at school and at work as being overly cerebral and lacking feeling. Must every Italian chef make lasagna? Every French chef coq au vin? Anita Lowe, who closed her fine dining restaurant Anissa in New York last year, cooked there for nearly 2 decades without fealty to one region or cultural tradition. This puzzled some diners. "I had someone come in and say, 'Where's the big Buddha head?'" she said. When publications request recipes and she submits one without Asian ingredients, the response is often, "We were really hoping for something Asian." Or Asianish, anything with soy apparently will do. "I send in Japanese, which isn't even my background, but that works," she said. The Korean-American chef, Corey Lee, in his menu cookbook, it's filled with stories of his grandmother foraging for acorns, of his mother forcing him to drink a tonic of deer antlers. All suggest that Lee's dishes, however rarefied, at Benu the tasting menu is $285 a head, are also deeply autobiographical. But Lee demurs, the way a novelist might, fending off a critic's attempt to find in his books correlations to actual events, wanting them to stand alone as fully imagined works of art. "There's great pressure for chefs to have a story," he said. "Maybe there's no story beyond, I want to serve this food and it tastes good." It's the eternal plea of the minority to ask to be judged not by one's appearance or the rituals of one's forebears, but for the quality of one's mind and powers of invention. Certainly our country was predicated on the right to shed one's past and be reborn, to come from nothing and work your way up. In this, Asians may be among the most American of Americans. But why is the choice always between exotic caricature or rootlessness? The philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues that the embrace of ethnic restaurants is merely tolerance of a folklorist other deprived of its substance. The real other is by definition patriarchal, violent, never the other of ethereal wisdom and charming customs. In the end, doesn't it matter, not to others, but to ourselves, where we are from? No, I don't mean originally. I mean the forces that made us, the immigrants who raised us with all their burdens and expectations, their exhortations to fit in but never forget who we are, and the country we grew up in. That is our only home, that taught us we are other, but also seems in some confused, tentative way to want to learn something from us. For Asian American chefs, this is the conundrum and the opportunity. The foods of their childhoods were once mocked and rejected by their non-Asian peers and by their ashamed or rebellious younger selves, then accepted in dilute, placating form, and now are able to command audiences who clamor for their sensations and aggressive flavors and who might be unnerved if they knew exactly what they were putting in their mouths. What may be most radical about Asian American cuisine is the attitude that informs and powers it, reflecting a new cockiness in a population that has historically been encouraged to keep quiet and lay low. It's food that celebrates crunchy cartilage and gelatinous ooze, that openly stinks, that declares, "This is what I like to eat." What about you? Do you dare? Thank you.
Thank you, Ligaya, so much. And I should add, too, that the piece that Ligaya just read from is also a really wonderful compliment to the work that she does on a weekly basis at the Times. So if you're not already a regular fanatic of her work, I highly recommend that you add it to your weekly must-read list. Our next reader is Lillian Li. Lillian Li's debut novel, Number One Chinese Restaurant, is a complex, feeling, and indelible portrait of a mainstay of American life that few Americans give much serious thought to. Her picture of the inner life of a Chinese restaurant in Maryland is shot through with criminal intrigue, simmering family resentment, the perils of spoiling ambition, and amidst all of that, the sweet privacy of unexpected love, the often stifling reliability of familial love. The Number One Chinese Restaurant isn't any one particular restaurant. It's an ideal whose shape depends on who is looking at it. For an older generation, it is a thriving business, perhaps culinarily unextraordinary, but a powerful tool to give their families the resources to succeed in a new country. For Jimmy, the son in the novel who's been tasked with running the successful family restaurant after his father's death, success means jettisoning the cliche trappings that have made his parents' restaurant so popular. As the book changes voices from dishwasher to hostess to owner, and so on through the ranks, you get a full view of the seething life of this place, of the unrelenting work involved in fitting in and in letting go. Please give a warm welcome to Lillian Li.
Damn, that was an introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out today. It is so good to see so many Asian faces. Oh my God. So my last two readings were in Ann Arbor, Michigan and Providence, Rhode Island, which are very charming towns with a lot of strengths, but having a large Asian population is not one of those strengths. So just truly thank you for having me out here. And thank you, Ligaya and Naben, for reading with me. Just very quickly, Ligaya, what you just read felt anthemic. It was really, it basically perfectly articulated a lot of the ideas that my novel just kind of like floats over. But that's the difference between nonfiction and fiction. And also thank you, Rohan, for moderating so charmingly, as I'm sure you will. And also, of course, thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop. I have seen the space in pictures as my friends have come through, Aro Kwan and Carlina, and I've just been so jealous to be up there where they were, and so it's just a huge pleasure to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and actually read from a latter part of the book. So usually when you first have your book come out, you can only really read from the beginning because no one has read it yet. But because of the theme of this panel, being about writing Asian American food, I felt, well, I have to read this later section. So hopefully not too many spoilers come through. But basically, essentially, like Rohan said, Jimmy Han is the current owner of his father's restaurant, the Beijing Duck House, which serves basically an American Chinese kind of menu, just with the prices super marked up, which I think is, a really smart idea, but I think Jimmy does not agree. So he's gone ahead and started his own restaurant, the Beijing Glory, which is all about Asian fusion, and it's also in the heart of DC. So where we are in the book right now is it's going to be the soft opening of the Beijing Glory, but the only thing is that Jimmy is quickly finding that he is way over his head. He's had to switch back from the Asian fusion menu that he wanted to his father's menu for a reason that I won't reveal. And he has just realized that the cooks he has hired are so new to America and to the kitchen that they don't actually know how to cook American Chinese food. So that's where we are. Oh, and one more thing is that there is a term that's used within this restaurant world. So the family refers to the Latino and Latina staff as amigos, and that is not necessarily a pejorative term, but it's also not a pejorative term. So that's just an explanatory note. Jimmy didn't even get halfway to the kitchen. At table 10, a waiter was cleaning bones off a customer's plate with his bare hands. He seized each chop as if he were about to pick it clean. It seemed to Jimmy that half the tables were still waiting for their food, that customers were tripping over one another to get to the bathroom. The layout of the seats was slightly imprecise. People couldn't push out their chairs without colliding straight into others. The tables themselves were meant to hold much smaller plates, and with no lazy Susans outfitting the larger groups, people dipped their shirt sleeves into their soup when they reached across the table for wonton chips. One peek into the kitchen confirmed it. Nothing fit together. Food was dying under the heat lamps. Order slips were on the ground. The new amigos couldn't communicate with the Chinese cooks who couldn't understand the American waiters. The Duck House's ecosystem had always seemed haphazard to Jimmy. But he now realized that it had had an internal logic, one he had not thought to construct for the glory. His father would have laughed in his face. It was easy to imagine what else his father would or would not have done. His father wouldn't have hired amigos who'd never worked in a Chinese kitchen, or Americans with tongues too lazy to learn the language that came from the back of the house. His father wouldn't have gone into debt for a flashy space surrounded by restaurants far more comfortable in their flashiness. The new place was everything his father distrusted. The outdoor patio would bring vermin and beggars. The partially exposed kitchen made even less sense. Who wanted to watch a fat cook scratch his ass and bang his wok? The floor plan was too open, the lighting too bright, and where, pray tell, was Jimmy going to find the time to clean all those windows? Why do people need a view? His father would have asked. They'll be sitting in their seats for hours. But his father had been blocked in by his own golden bricks, his dreams compressed like a watermelon grown in a cinder block. Jimmy had different plans. He was not going to be so obsessed with monthly returns. He was going to focus on the big picture. He was finally going to get his hands on the status that had eluded his family, rich as they were or had been. He was going to grow that intangible capital that reached where money couldn't go. But in this strident difference, would Jimmy elude the money as well? Would his restaurant drag him down, taking his apartment, Janine, his family, his livelihood with it? He'd spent his entire life working in a restaurant. He'd never graduated from college. If they charged him with insurance fraud, he would have a record on top of everything. How could a restaurant this fucking big feel so small? A fist formed around Jimmy's lungs. Steel fingers crushed the air out as soon as he sucked in. Yet with each cruel squeeze of his chest, there followed an opposite reaction, one of expanding heat, energizing heat. Anger built deep in his gut until his body hummed from the need to do some necessary violence. He set off for the waiter with a tray full of bones, a moon-faced white boy named Tom. He pulled him into the nearest station where the other new servers could overhear. Grabbing Tom by the wrist, Jimmy forced him to look at the greasy print on his arm. "You an animal?" Jimmy asked. Tom shook his head. Jimmy grabbed the plate of bones off his tray and threw it to the ground. "And use your spoons to pick up the bones like I taught you." He left Tom on his knees, spoons clinking together. The waiters who'd stopped to look quickened their pace. Swing by the cloak closet, Jimmy hung up his jacket and pushed up his sleeves. Then he headed toward the kitchen. He threw the first cook, a large stooped man with one bloodshot eye, off the line. Taking his place in front of the flaming wok, Jimmy motioned for the others to give him their tickets. He gave half to the one veteran cook in the entire kitchen, a grizzled man who rubbed the white stubble on his face as he received the tickets with an otherwise neutral face. "Throw out your food," Jimmy shouted in wooden Chinese. He tied on an apron. He had the cooks gather as closely around the wok as the narrow space allowed. "Pay attention. Then you cook like me." He cranked the burner as high as it would go until the air in front of his face shimmered with heat. Then he dropped his ladle into the drum of peanut oil by the wok, pouring it straight into the pan. "Always more oil," he demanded. "More, even more." He swirled the oil around in his wok, coating the entire surface, then poured the oil back into the drum. Filling his ladle part way again, he wet the wok with one more splash of oil and cracked eggs into the gleaming puddle. Stirring the yellow around, he grabbed a container of rice, dumped it in. Mixing the rice into the oil and eggs, he lifted the wok with his left hand. One heavy flick, and the rice transformed into a wave, cresting over the edge of the rim and breaking back down into the center of the pan. Again, he tasted sweat as he flipped the fried rice 3 more times. "Do it till your wrist breaks." While he rested his hand, he pressed the rice down with the back of his ladle until each individual grain was crisping in oil. He handed the wok back to its owner, instructing him to toss the rice until he saw it dance. Then he took over the next wok, refilling his ladle with oil. He moved down the line, wok by wok. He left a new cook to finish each dish he started. He showed them how to boil vegetables in a spider perched over hot water and how to measure everything with their ladle, from salt to soy sauce to green onions. He demonstrated kung pao shrimp, instructing the cooks how long to fry the peanuts and how to jostle the frying cage to make sure the oil dropped off the nuts. They saw how to coat thin slices of flank steak with cornstarch for extra crispy Mongolian beef, and how to pre-cook chunks of chicken in deep oil in their woks. By the time he reached the veteran cook, taking just over 15 minutes, his line was busy again, and he was free to wipe the sweat from his eyes. "Give them back their tickets," he told the old cook, clapping him on the back. Around him, the kitchen was alive with fire and fragrance. Iron clinked against steel, and the smell of sizzling meat turned heavy in the air. The first cook, the one with the bloodshot eye, finished his dish. He presented his plate, his nose running from the heat. Jimmy grabbed a nearby spoon and carved into the mound of fried rice. He barely tasted the perfect combination of salt and grease before he bit down hard on the spoon, his teeth aching against the metal. Dirty tasting spoon in mouth, he was the spitting image of his father. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian. And for those of you who aren't already aware of this perfectly serendipitous fact, we have copies of Lillian's book for sale in the back of the room. It just went out yesterday, right? From Henry Holt, so do pick up a copy. Our next reader is Naben Ruthnum. Like curry itself, Naben Ruthnum's book is many things. It starts as a critique of those books tinged by nostalgia that have come to be known variously as currybooks or silk and sari books. And in this, the book is already a success in introducing the possibility of a book that breaks out of the conformity that readers expect in books about the South Asian diaspora. But the book also investigates itself against these criteria, finding that perhaps there is something in the nostalgia of curry books that is baked into the experience of being part of a diaspora, not an inevitability, but a tide that persists in a certain direction, but which you can nonetheless fight against. Naben Ruthnum's own curry book is a bracing, clarifying mix of modes: memoir, cultural critique and history, and enthralling provocation. His new thriller, Find You in the Dark, is actually also out newly from Atria Books, so do check that out at your local bookstore or online. And we have copies of Curry for sale as well in the back. Please give a warm welcome to Naben Ruthnum.
Thank you. Curry is not a cliche. Well, maybe it is. The unifying notion of curry as an authentic, homeland-defining collection of dishes that form a cultural touchstone for diasporic brown folks is a cliche, in the same way food-based bonds between people from any culture who find themselves in a new land is a cliche. But curry can't be trapped. If you push through the cliche, you arrive at a surprising truth. The history of this ever-inauthentic mass of dishes is a close parallel to the formation of South Asian diasporic identity, which is as much of a blend of conflicting cultural messages forced into coherence as Indian cuisine itself. Then again, the entire category of food writing comes with built-in nostalgia, a resurrection of remembered meals that, at its best, creates hunger to recreate that experience. When the topic, or the writer, is associated with a certain ethnic background, that act of nostalgia is positioned as a cultural act of looking back. The New Yorker's Adam Gopnik splits the food literature genre into two categories. There are two schools of good writing about food, the mock epic and the mystical microcosmic. The mock epic, A.J. Liebling, Calvin Trillin, the French writer Robert Courtine, and any good restaurant critic, is essentially comic and treats the small ambitions of the greedy eater as though they were big and noble, spoofing the idea of the heroic while raising the minor subject to at least temporary greatness. The mystical microcosmic, of which Elizabeth David and M.F.K. Fisher are the masters, is essentially poetic and turns every remembered recipe into a meditation on hunger and the transience of its fulfillment. I hope that wasn't an unfair Adam Gopnik voice. I just wanted to, differentiate. Food writing is also memoir, at least outside the confines of the newspaper restaurant review. The elemental is elemental to a life story. M.F.K. Fisher's rapturous descriptions of meals in France are also the story of an adventurous American woman abroad, eating, writing, and living in quaint circumstances with a husband or between marriages. A great portion of Fisher's and Elizabeth David's writings deal with food and food experiences in France and continental Europe, an ongoing suggestion to readers that real food was something that existed elsewhere, not in the country of the writer's origin, America and England, respectively. Fisher's adventurous trip to isolated restaurants in Burgundy, where she served pickled herring that is mild, pungent, meaty as fresh nuts, and trout served au bleu, gutted and cooked half alive in bouillon, agonizingly curled on a platter, is as much about the hidden chef and the exuberant server, the sense of being alone and given a unique gift in a foreign land, as it is about the food, which Fisher actually describes in rather quick little clauses, compared to the considerable time given to describing the mad waitress, fanatical about food like a medieval woman possessed by the devil, and her own sensations of hunger, surfeit, determination, and even fear in the face of an epic meal. There are certainly exceptions to this questing in a foreign land in each writer's oeuvre, from Fisher's Pain to Old Mary the Cook's peach pie at her family's California ranch, to Elizabeth David's English bread and yeast cookery. But Fisher's rapturous descriptions of French meals and life, and David's landmark recipe books, Mediterranean Food and French Provincial Cooking, established their reputations and carried a clear message. The truest experiences of eating are out there, là-bas, and the amateur cook's hopeless task is to try to create the real thing at home. When a food writer is a South Asian immigrant, or even a few generational steps from a plane or a boat, another ripple enters. One of the conventions of diasporic food writing dictates that the writer's identity and self-discovery are implicitly linked to a tracing back of culinary roots, a finding out of who he or she really is in the rich smell of a Kerala masala, finely nailed. That's the extra dimension to writing about curry and other ethnic foods. Beyond meditating on hunger and fulfillment, writing about curry in India and the real food of one's ancestors becomes a meditation on personal and familial identity and its relationship to the place where one grew up or where one was wrested away from. The inability of the writer to reproduce his or her mother's aloo gobi often becomes, as if by default, a metaphor for the impossibility of full communication between generations, a metaphor so overwrought it's now is codified and recognizable as a no-mask. In The Long Way Home, a 2004 essay for The New Yorker, Pulitzer Prize-winning Indian-American novelist Jhumpa Lahiri contributes to this form of writing that connects family roots, secrets, and the lost unknowables of the past, incarnated in particular delicious dishes. In Lahiri's case, her mother had learned to cook by witnessing and participating in her own mother's cooking in Calcutta, learning lessons that she carried to America by, for example, getting down on the floor to pound turmeric or chilies on a massive grinding stone. Lahiri's mother here joins a line of mothers in this food writing tradition. Like so many before her, she kindly evades sharing her recipes, never records or verbally details them. To this day, if friends ask how she made a particular dish, she cryptically replies, "It's nothing really, you simply take all the ingredients and put them in the pot." This reluctance to share methods is perhaps true of many mothers and extremely common in these nostalgic essays and stories. My mother, thankfully, will give up any recipe with detailed directions. Lahiri ends up learning her Indian cooking techniques from a cookbook by Madhur Jaffrey, doyen of subcontinental cookery books and TV since the early 1970s. In the end, her mother is quietly impressed, taking a photo of the spread that Lahiri and her sister make for their parents' 30th anniversary. In 2016, the writer Sachi Kool contributed to the genre with an essay for BuzzFeed on learning how to cook the dishes of her childhood as an adult. There's no recipe for growing up, was the name. My mom had watched my grandmother cook for years, knew her languages, knew how to pleat her sari or mutter a Kashmiri insult, or throw a wedding for her son 25 years after she moved away. I don't have any of these secrets because I was born in North America and raised around white people in a family that wanted to integrate. So it felt important to at least try to remember how my own mom did things. Late last week, I called my mom to get a refresher on a few of her recipes. I wanted to make Rogan Josh, aloo gobi, chicken biryani, and paneer with palak. But my mom, like so many Indian mothers I know, has always avoided giving me complete recipes. Mothers are an important and authentic part of the curry genre, both cooked and written. Not only a source of accessible cross-cultural nostalgia, but a reminder that there are domestic, comforting aspects to exoticism. The parental link to the homeland, especially for writers with immigrant parents who themselves were born in the West, or who moved to the West at such a young age that their grasp on the old country remains light. Questioned by brown people who dismiss their experiences or white people who say, "But you seem so white," can also have a sinister, minimizing aspect. If mothers are baggaged with the symbolic weight of a motherland and the author's distance from this place and identity, they sometimes aren't given much room of their own to be intact characters themselves. Mothers are permitted to be mysterious or generous in this system of symbolism, but in Lahiri's essay, her mother's pattern of selective withholding becomes her primary trait. In Lahiri, the writer is burdened with mastering the domestic skill of cooking in order to achieve an understanding and connection with her mother. In Kool's piece, being able to cook her mother's food comes to stand in for her need for her mother's love and presence. Kool manages to pull off cooking a solid meal, catching the intangible sense of her mother's kitchen while she prepares it. But the meal wasn't as good because my food, as surprisingly palatable as it was, didn't include my mom hovering over me with a wooden spoon. For these writers, their personal relationships with their mothers overwhelms the symbolic stand-in of mother for motherland, of food and the ability to prepare it properly as a marker of authenticity. But for many readers, this may not be the case. The mother on the page remains a symbolic stand-in for authenticity lost, despite each individual writer's labor to own the metaphor, to make it personal. In part, these two pieces reflect ways I've found myself thinking about my race and family, and even writing about these matters, at least until I stop myself out of fear that I'm replicating an essay that already exists. That this treatment of a relationship between food, family bonds, and a fraying connection to the homeland appears frequently in essays and novels by diasporic South Asians doesn't invalidate it. An oft-repeated story isn't a false one. Experiences and dishes like the ones described by Kuhl and Lahiri take place in the kitchens of brown undergraduates worldwide. The two essays above hit many of the same points about authenticity, love, and the unknowability of one's parents, but stylistically they are distinct to their authors, and there's no sense that the details are anything but true, lived experience. I mean, I've had a bunch of these experiences too. A recipe is given over the phone, but a half pound of burnt onions and candied walnuts subbing for almond slivers later, there's a stovetop of muck that has nothing to do with home, comfort, or good food. Just failure, distance, and a sense that something essential has been lost. This is authentic, isn't it? It's also relatable to readers from any numbers of immigrant backgrounds. So why shouldn't it be written about? It should be, of course. Stories beget similar stories, and they don't become lies as a result. But endless encounters with one narrative, one that tells us that truth and colonialism are embedded in these family recipes and our failures to cook them, make me wonder why I keep reading this particular story over and over again, and why white and South Asian publics alike embrace it. South Asian food came to major prominence in the West with the explosion of Indian restaurants in the UK, and the formative wave of South Asian diasporic writers followed soon afterward. When genres and forms have been around for long enough, there comes a point when they risk calcifying, becoming the same stories. This narrative thread, this way of thinking about curry, is one iteration of what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie recently called the single story, one overarching narrative that creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they aren't true, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Thinking about and writing about a food as culturally complex as curry, as though it were a marker of an authentic past that is now lost, or a signifier of a broken bond between generations due to geographical dislocation, does a major disservice to how delicious curry can be, and to how particular a South Asian diasporic experience can be. Thank you.
I want to thank all of you guys again. It was amazing listening to all of you speak. And I want to preface this entire segment by saying that I'm very intimidated by this chair, but I'm hoping that it doesn't have the same effect on you guys. But listening to all of you speak and hearing you talk about food in your various ways, it really made me think about how, though all of you talk about food in your work, you all approach it from very different angles. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the particular role that food plays in your individual works. In any order, Naben, if you want to start.
I mean, I never thought it was something that I would write about necessarily. It was something that I cooked and ate. But I always enjoyed food writing as a consumer, and I thought that I could use it in a way to talk about culture and literature in a way that didn't feel too much like grad school. I felt that I was really trying to self-educate myself as a nonfiction writer when I wrote this book, which hopefully accounts for some of its clumsiness. And I feel like writing about food, which I'd never done before, allowed me to both be lighter about concepts that I couldn't be light about when I was talking about literature and my career frustrations. And it also allowed me to penetrate historically in a way that I'd never really done before in nonfiction writing.
Well, and it sort of brings to mind, you said about, doing this in a way that it was approachable. One of the real, and I addressed this sort of confusingly in my introduction about writing about food in a complex way, is that food often is delicious, and this is what we like about it. And yet, we have people like me going out and saying, well, you really have to talk about it in a way that's unpleasant and brings up, because there's a lot that undergirds it that is very unpleasant and unseemly and can be complicated. And I guess the real complication for you guys is how do you bring those two things together in a way that's both educational and sort of palatable? I don't know if you guys want to add on.
Yeah, I think that disgusting food is a really good segue into what I was going to say, which is that, so before I wrote Number One Chinese Restaurant, I actually had the experience of working as a waitress at a Chinese restaurant for a very brief amount of time. I was very bad at the job. And I think that, I was expecting to be kind of inundated with food, to have food all the time, to have delicious food, to sort of be smelling tasty things all the time. And instead, that experience, I've never felt more distant from food. More like I couldn't approach it, more like food was something disgusting that made my hair smell awful every single night, that burned my hands. I only could see it as a way that, it's almost like a vehicle for other ideas, right? I stopped thinking of it as a concrete, tangible thing that is delicious, and more as, a way to talk about class, a way to talk about what is respectable cuisine. And actually, I had to, my first, couple of drafts of the book, there was no mention of food being tasty. It was all about grease. It was all about fat. It was all about, pain. And I had my editor finally pull me aside and say, "Do you like food?" And I said, "Yes, of course I do." She's like, "Okay, well, I'd like to see more of that." And so I think it is something that it is easy to forget, because food is also such a rich vehicle for a lot of more abstract ideas, and it can also hide a lot of really problematic ideas. And so it's easy for me to kind of float away from what's right in front of me.
I kind of have the opposite problem. So I've been writing my column for 11 years now. I've been reviewing restaurants for that. Oh, not this column, but I've been writing about food and writing about restaurants for 11 years. And I think probably at least 5 years ago, I ran out of ways to write about food. And so to write about the deliciousness, that something is sweet or sour or bitter or is crunchy on the outside but soft on the inside, and all of these things, all the different adjectives to say something is laced with this or suffused with this or spiked with this. And I thought, I don't know what to do. I either have to move into another profession or something has to change. And so what changed for me was I had to write around the food. I had to find all the other stories in the food. And the truth is, so for me, I think, yes, something is delicious, but that's ephemeral. I've become much more interested in the stories of the people who make food. And so when I think about my column now, I really think about it as bringing these stories to the fore.
And it's a wonderful reminder, too, of how we create these artificial sort of divides between, let's say, food and life, and food writing and writing, when in fact these things sort of intermingle all the time. And I think your columns really do a great job. They can be a straightforward review of a place, but it evokes so much more than that, which I think is what most people are looking for, in writing anyway. My next question is about how, when you document a food, whether it's the cuisine of a country that you visited or you read a review about a restaurant, it also elevates it to the point where other people can become interested in it and want to learn more about it. And the sort of attendant effect of this is also that people sort of develop this mania for figuring out what's authentic. And this certainly has its good points. I think it forces restaurants to be more adventurous, to try new things, to be pushing themselves. But there's a dark side to it, too. I was wondering if, and this is true of writing, too, sort of battling expectations of what you're supposed to write, and having other people judge whether or not what you're writing is sort of a true reflection of something. I was wondering if you guys could weigh in on that.
I feel like authentic has felt like a word. Felt like a word that has been sort of more and more on trend lately, and it almost seems to have taken the place that exotic used to fill. Now that we know that exotic is not an okay word to use, right? Now, for some reason, I feel like authentic is the word that makes our food legible to the white consumer. And in and of itself, that word, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a pretty neutral word, as most words go, but it does feel in some ways like a kind of guideline now that it feels very, very restrictive. And when I think about the food that I eat at home that my parents make for me, I've often tried to find those recipes online, and I just can't find them, because those are, in fact, recipes that they, adapted for the Western kitchen, right? When they didn't have certain kind of vents and they didn't have certain materials and they didn't have certain ingredients, this is the food they ended up making. And it feels authentic in that it is sincere and genuine, and it came from something organic that my family developed together. But at the same time, I don't think that anyone who ate over at my parents' house would feel like they were eating authentic Chinese food. So it is something that I wonder about. And I feel like in general, when a word starts becoming kind of buzzy like that, it seems to be an invitation to examine it and to ask what it's kind of holding a place for, what people are actually saying when they're saying that word.
Sometimes I look back on things that I wrote early on as a food writer, and I'm embarrassed. And one thing early on, I think I described a California roll as with that, avocado, that eternal interloper. So I was buying into this idea that it's not authentic. But, California rolls were invented by Japanese immigrants from Japan who were in Los Angeles in the 60s, and you couldn't get good tuna all year round. And what does California have? A lot of avocados. In a way, it's a completely smart innovation that we now then say, oh, but that means it's not a real Japanese restaurant if they're using avocado. So when I look back on that, I think I was just buying into this narrative that I really don't think is true anymore. I think there are many different ways that the food of any particular culture can be made, and adaptations are inevitable because the ingredients aren't even the same. Even if they are technically the same, they're grown in different soil. It's just different, and that's part of what's exciting. And I think that immigrant-run restaurants just get held to this absurd standard where some people who aren't of that culture but who have traveled a lot think, I've been to Thailand a few times and I know exactly what Thai food should taste like. And it is depressing if you've been to Thailand to eat at Thai restaurants in the United States. I will agree that is often true, but it's just not fair at the same time to have this standard. That's what I've found.
And an added complication to that is, I think the people who are often guilty of judging these restaurants to be inadequate often are immigrants themselves. I've definitely gone to restaurants and be like, oh, this isn't authentic. But if someone who wasn't Indian were to say that, I was like, oh, God, this person is insufferable. So there's definitely a sort of a continuum of egregiousness over there.
Yeah, I find a lot of people who are really engaged with authenticity would actually be horrified at the authentic stories of the food sailing. The Portuguese brought chilies to India. Many of your favorite curries were originally invented in UK curry houses. The Mughal Empire had a huge influence on Indian foods that we eat now. Empire and colonialism have always been laced through authentic Indian food, and that to me is so fascinating. And it's not to say that it's my stamp of approval on colonialism and empiricism, but I do find the authentic history of these dishes is so much more interesting than the way authenticity is used.
Because when you have like this sort of imprimatur on something, it's like, this is authentic, then that ceases to be a story. Whereas if you're constantly investigating and things are always changing, there's life to it, and you can sort of find out more about, because each recipe, each time you make it, is an invention. Even if it's the same recipe, you have to sort of kowtow to circumstances, to time, to the availability of produce where you live. And isn't that what good writing does too? It sort of has to adapt and live, right? My next question sort of steps off from something that Lillian has in her book, in which one of the characters says, you are the stories people tell of you. And this is near the end of the book, after which you've gone through a very complicated process of finding out about all the details of these people's lives. It gets really, some of it is very sordid, some of it is very beautiful, but you have a very complicated picture of their lives. And at the end, you still have this notion that you can still be sort of summed up by the way that people see you. And this is true of many minority groups in this country. It's always been true of disenfranchised groups everywhere. And so my question, and perhaps it's an unfair one, but is this an unfair expectation to put on writers who are expected to represent non-white cultures?
Yes.
Next question. No, no, no.
I think that I hear from a lot of writers of color, myself included, that we often feel like we are not blank enough and that we don't have the requisite experience or the requisite knowledge, the requisite stories to be able to tell what feels true to us. And I think that stems from this idea that we are the ones who are bringing our story into the mainstream. And I think that ends up, in some ways, turning writers almost against each other, because it's a criticism that is so easily lobbed, and it's one that is so devastating. And it's also one that, in some ways, hides its devastation in this kind of abstract idea of what is enough. So I think that, in general, this idea of writing and representing feels like a guideline that is making it so that we cannot be kind to ourselves and kind to each other. So at least that is where my head is at the moment. I mean, I just came out with a book, so this might be some hedging on my end as well.
I mean, even in so-called service writing, which I use this term very loosely, there is always this tension between the sort of ameliorative work of writing and then the sort of expository, the sort of exploratory work of writing. Like, how do you balance the two things where you can do something good through writing and then you can just do good writing?
I'm an amoral, selfish writer. So I, of course, I engage with that question in my life and when I'm walking around, but I never do at my desk in terms of should I be doing something good with this? And because I spend so much of my time writing not just fiction, but very story, plot-oriented, entertaining thriller fiction, that kind of question only comes up when I'm asking myself, am I doing something deliberately immoral in this story? Like, for example, am I glorifying the pain of a victim in this narrative? When it comes to should I be writing educationally, perhaps, in a way, which I think is a pressure we all feel, I rail almost immaturely, it's a teenage metalhead in me, against that so much. No, I refuse. And yet I did write this book, which it is in a way a memoir of my education, my struggle of how to write about these things that are really important to me, how to write about myself and my own particular version of this brownness, of this South Asianness. But I always say, I didn't do it for the audience. I did it for myself. Yes.
And when we talked earlier, you had a great comment about sort of occasionally being plagued by these doubts that you were somehow letting down the home team by sort of telling tales out of school. You're like, oh, this is something I don't like about the way that we write about ourselves.
Yeah, the last thing I want is and this is sometimes when I look into an audience, I think, is there a 20-year-old MFA student who does write nostalgically about homeland, about her parents, who's listening to me and thinking that I'm saying, your writing is dog shit, which is extremely not what I'm saying. I'm saying we should be able to write about anything we want to, and many of those stories are extremely valuable. But I do think that there is a significant amount of audience and publication industry pressure to continually tell stories that are like that one. And also, as I was talking about with Cool and Lahiri's essays, both of which I really like, especially Lahiri's, I can't help but think of the person reading it, who is not me, and how they flatten out that relationship between the daughter and the mother, and they see it as between the West and the East.
Ligaya, do these tensions play out at all in your work, do you find?
Well, I was going to say that in some sense, I guess I do think of my writing as service journalism, the way you were saying. I feel like when I was just writing about food and saying that things were delicious, I just had a sense that I would kind of introduce myself to people. I'm the frivolous writer. I just write about food. I just write about style. And so to kind of, at a certain point with my column, when I decided, I know I have a mission that I'm going to write about all of these places that people don't know about and these peoples that they don't know about who live in our city. That gave my work meaning that I hadn't had before. And I feel like there are certain things, sometimes when I'm sending my editor my list of restaurants, he says, how do you keep finding all these Filipino restaurants? And I don't know if he's realized yet that I'm just sneaking them in because I want the people of America to realize what Filipino food is. I feel like that nothing else will be my legacy, that people of New York understand what Filipino food is. So, and I think someone on Twitter suggested, what if everybody just tried writing stories that were about people of color for a year? No stories about white people. And I thought, well, that just is my column. That's just what it is. Like I just don't write about Western restaurants. They don't fall under my rubric. So, so I feel like I do have a secret agenda.
Wait, was she saying that, like white authors should also write people of color for a year?
She wasn't specific.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want that. But I just want to add one more thing, which is that, I think that I write to try and figure out how to be a better person, or maybe what I mean is to be a more active and observant person in the world. And I think that that's not a bad guideline, at least for me, in terms of what story I want to tell, is which story do I need to tell in order to understand the world that I am seeing and I am moving through better so that I can better interact with it.
All right, well, there's a very tangible limit to what I can add to this conversation. So at this point, I invite, if any of you have any questions for the panelists, just raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone.
This is specifically for Ligaya. I was wondering if your editor ever rejected a restaurant choice that you made and why they might have.
They have never done this because they have no idea. I just send in this list. I'm like, there's a Belarusian place out in Sheepshead Bay, and there's a Thai place here, and there's this place there, and they just say, okay. So I'm lucky. They have a lot of trust, and they're interested. The whole point, they have empowered me, I should say. It is not a battle. They've given me this mission, and they're excited about it as well. So that hasn't happened.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful stories. A lot of your writing explores family histories that are contained with food, and also how a lot of Asian cultures see food as a communal thing inherently. And I was wondering how entering food writing has changed your relationship with your family and how you view your own heritage. Like, how has food writing changed you?
So as part of like a promotional thing that I was doing that now I just think is really fun, I started an author newsletter, and I used that as an excuse so that my parents might finally share their recipes with me, because they never were interested before. They thought they were helping my career. And I realized that I think that what really draws me into learning these recipes that they make, that they often say evokes, a home for them or childhood for them, is that at least, so my parents are from mainland China, and they lived through the Cultural Revolution, and that means that, I have had to understand that there are certain stories I might just never get to hear, that it would be too painful or traumatic for them to share it and to relive it, and, I have had that chance to kind of mourn the loss of that history. And I feel like that grief was then sublimated into a desire to learn how to cook meals that then could take the place of that childhood that I wasn't going to be able to get, right? That if I could cook the food that makes them think of home in my home, that is a way of understanding the stories that are, lost to us at this moment and maybe forever. So I think that is what really clicked for me when I finally started making, the food in my own kitchen.
I do talk about my parents quite a bit in this book, which is just going to happen if you write a curry book. And it has had actually kind of a gratifying impact in the world for my mother, in that a magazine in Australia and one in Canada printed her shrimp curry recipe, which is, though she really liked that. So, and similar to you, my father is sort of like the father in the Wonder Years, in that we don't ever discuss anything directly. We talk about books and movies, and I feel that writing a book, partially about him and me, has allowed us to talk about our lives as though it's another book. So I feel that helps.
I should say that I didn't grow up eating Filipino food because my mother is this is on permanent record, so I'm sorry to say this, but she's not a great cook. And my father, who is an Englishman, did most of the cooking. He made curry, beef curry. I'm sure it doesn't resemble anything I've ever had at any South Asian restaurant anywhere, but it was delicious. So my mom occasionally would make Filipino food, and I didn't like it, and I had some bad memories associated with it. So my job has changed the fact that now I love Filipino food. I've discovered it. I had to go elsewhere to find it. And so now when I see my mom, we can talk about Filipino food, and I ask her lots of questions about customs that I had no interest in when I was a kid. So it actually has completely changed my relationship with my mom for the better.
So on the topic of parents, I guess through writing, like a lot of times you might talk about your feelings, or as a writer you might be more expressive in your feelings, but for at least for my parents who are from Hong Kong, I feel like they're not as expressive in their feelings, and sometimes when I compare to like my friends who are, like they do talk about their feelings with their parents, I'm like, oh, should I feel guilty about that? Like, how else can I communicate with my parents in a way that's like still like meeting each other halfway, but like not having them to talk about feelings? I don't know if this makes sense, but if you have any thoughts on that, yeah.
And like food can, evoke a lot of emotions that otherwise are sort of under the surface. Like you said, it allowed you a segue into talking about things with your father, for example.
I've kind of accepted that my mom isn't going to talk about her feelings. And I think once you accept that, that then it's totally okay. You express what you want. They kind of stand there stiffly when you hug them. And I think that at a certain point, but I'm older than you, I think it all just evens out. You kind of take them for what they can give you, and then they kind of loosen up a little bit. That's been my experience just over time. I just feel like at a certain point we have to stop expecting from them what they just can't give. It's just not going to happen in the way that we might want it. But if you can perceive in what they're giving you that there is still something there, then so it requires a compromise from us.
Yeah, I find that what my fear is about showing my parents my work is that they will actually be hurt by my feelings, that they will see a different side of me and a different side of them that I am seeing, and that it will be too much for them, that they'll break down underneath the cruelty of my words. And so I was always very, very frightened to show them the stuff that I was writing. And I recently made a kind of pact with myself to stop hiding the writing that I was writing about them, where they were the focal point, because I just didn't think it was fair anymore that I could have all of these readers know so much about our relationship and about them, and they would be in the dark. And so the first essay that I gave to my parents was actually one that I wrote recently for Medium about my father and his relationship with food and diabetes. And I was terrified to show it to him because in it I talk a lot about his mortality, and I just figured that's not something I want to bring up for him, right? That's going to be too hard for him to grapple with his mortality through my words. And it was when I finally gave it to him and he read it quickly and he sent a message back that was just like, "It's great, very proud of you, very funny." Love you. And I just realized that, I'd had this idea of my parents as so fragile, and that they would be broken by my words, but that, they have survived so much. And in the end, they are so much stronger than I gave them credit for, emotionally and physically. And so that was definitely something that has changed recently for me.
Can I just interject? You know that famous Czesław Milosz saying, when a writer is born into a family, that family is finished.
There's another one that I can't remember whose it is, but you have to write as though your parents are dead. In my sister has a very close and emotionally open relationship with both my parents. I don't, which I think we can all tell who the problem here. But I do feel that through my work, as with you, that we have managed to establish these rapports. But this really, I can't put a finger on how much regret I'll be flooded with when they're dead just yet. But I think there will be some. I don't. So you're asking the wrong person for advice. You're directing it at me. But that all sounded really good.
Hi there. So going back to the idea, I guess, of Asian Americanists and authenticity, I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on, I guess, the idea of, in food, the idea of either cultural, like a welcome cultural participation versus maybe like overstepping to cultural appropriation of some sort. And thinking back to back when I remember white people discovering bubble tea or discovering soup dumplings or discovering pho even, the idea that at the end of the day, is representation worth it? Is it just good just to be represented?
I think the issue of appropriation in food is really difficult because I think that if people outside what we're talking about is people outside a culture coming in and making the food of another culture. So I think that if it is done with respect and scholarship, I feel like that should be allowed. I mean, I think we should want everyone to want to learn about other cultures and cuisines. And I think that I once had a kind of a Twitter fight with someone who was angry because I had reviewed a restaurant that was serving, it was called Goa Taco. But it was not serving South Asian food. It was serving food from different cultures using naan to make not a taco, but a taco-like structure. So there were many issues. So when I wrote about it, I thought it's so clear this chef is not attempting to do anything remotely authentic. There's no pretense here. So let's be grateful for that. The food was delicious. I wrote about that. Clearly somebody was interested in many different cuisines. And then somebody called me out on Twitter and said, how dare you give this person any kind of platform, when this was a person who was making paratha and was of South Asian ancestry and felt that this was appropriation. So in the argument, what I said was, I feel like this is totally valid to talk about. I don't think this person is saying that what they're doing is South Asian. And it's so far from being South Asian that I couldn't personally take offense of it. And I think the other issue is that this isn't a person who's making a lot of money. This is the other idea about appropriation. The idea is that someone's making money off your food. And this was some small hole-in-the-wall, somebody who didn't have a lot of money running a restaurant. But I also said, I feel like our culinary conversation would be impoverished if all of these ingredients and flavors were not part of it. And I, for one, think that, I can't help it. I think that Western cuisine is improved by Asian ingredients. So I want all those chefs to be using them. So I think the issue has more to do with money and resources. So the fact is that white people can just get loans and investors for their restaurants fast. That's the issue. The issue isn't can they cook this food, so long as they cook it with respect. The issue is why do we take that more seriously why do we take a white chef cooking Thai food more seriously than we might a Thai person, a Thai immigrant. So that, I think, when you look at the problem in that way, it's not about attacking. It's not that no white person can cook this food. At least that's my thought.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add on that, within your question, you use that word discover. And I think that's a really key, distinction. The use of that word is what feels like appropriation to me because within it, there's a lot of hubris, right? I discovered this thing that so many people already knew about. And I feel like, the difference between appropriation and cooking with flavors that are not from your region or background is humility, is a feeling of humbling, right? To just, when you see these new ingredients, you see boba, what you should be what would feel like it was not appropriation if that person was just like, oh my God, how did I not know about this, right? I must be really behind on the times, this has really opened my world, thank you for this. And I remember that after Anthony Bourdain died, there was, and I'm blanking on the name, but there was an Asian American person who tweeted that what we really appreciated about Anthony Bourdain when he talked about food from different cultures was that he would kick it with grandma in the kitchen because he understood that he was the one who had something to learn. And so it feels like that distinction feels real to me when somebody is humbled by a new cuisine and when somebody just sees it as a chance to kind of slip it into their cultural tool belt and to show their friends that they've found something delightful and new. That's the difference for me.
Like Ligaya was saying too, what seems like a model but hard to sort of put into implementation plan is rather than subtracting white chefs, we should be adding more chefs of color. But like you said, there are so many impediments to that in practical terms too.
Hi, this question is for Ligaya. So I've been thinking about this Anthony Bourdain quote. He mentioned on his show that he would sometimes withhold the name of a place that he had gone to. And he did that because he was aware of the impact, being on his show could have on that place, and it could fundamentally change that space and what it was. And he felt like there was something, he made the decision that there was something precious about not altering the place, but still talking about it. And so I wonder, like in your job, do you ever grapple with this question, because you do focus on kind of, smaller places. Do you ever grapple with, I really appreciate this place, but I have this big platform. Might I change the space in covering it? And like one thing I would add to that is, one thing I love about Filipino restaurants still is that when I go there, it's full of Filipino people. And whether it's fair or not, like I think I would feel a way if I went into those spaces and saw less and less of them there. It would change the space for me. So I'm curious, like how you grapple with that.
I don't know how much power my column has. I feel like it can be transformative for places in Manhattan or near Brooklyn, but I've had a lot of places that I've covered that have closed within the year of me writing about them. So I feel like when I write about a place in the Bronx or that's really deep in Brooklyn or deep in Queens, that some people go. Some people just like to read about it and know that it exists. So, I keep track of all the ones that have closed. And sometimes I think, is it my fault because their rents went up? What happened? But I have to admit, I have never not reviewed a place that I liked. Partly because I don't feel like it's my secret. First of all, I don't feel like I've discovered any place. All these places exist. They serve the communities they serve. I'm the stranger walking in. I try to walk in with respect. And I feel like when I write about a place, I want to give enough of a sense of it that people would know whether they want to make the same journey there. So I hope that when I write about these places, I write about them in a way that the people who will go will also be respectful. So I have it, I guess, because I just don't think it's happened that these places are overrun by thrill seekers. I don't feel like that's happening. But I do think a lot of these places struggle. I have had some restaurateurs have cried on the phone when I'm fact checking because the thought of being in the New York Times is overwhelming to them as a reward for years of hard work. And I'm very moved by that because I don't know what it will bring them. It might bring them nothing. I just don't know. But I feel like it could also change. There was this guy. I mean, this was a Manhattan place, but he had this closet of a falafel place, literally maybe 2 feet wide, that he was cooking out of. And then my review ran, and a month later, he has the whole next storefront. So that's exciting to me. I want all of them to benefit in some way.
Thanks. My question is just whether any of you have felt the limitations of writing about food as a means to experience a culture. Because, I mean, certainly food is a big part of that experience, but I think, I mean, there can also be this limitation of someone going to a restaurant and feeling then that they have had this cultural experience and that's kind of it. Or that this culture, even though food is very important, can be represented primarily through food, when there are, just infinite other ways, expressions of culture. And if you've ever felt that limitation in either fiction or nonfiction.
I think perhaps due to my lack of kind of service skill as a food writer, I couldn't write a solid good restaurant review that would be top class. I think because of that, I always from the beginning have been looking for in my own food writing, the historical story and the cultural story around the food. So it's always been, I've never looked at it as a limitation, because I've always known that for me, because of the particular things that I can be good at, I can't just limit myself to that plate. And I think, honestly, with any food writing, it has to expand beyond just the food. The food is going to be your starting point. I think a lot of people who do go into a restaurant and think that they've come out with a fuller understanding of that culture, of whatever food they've been eating there, are often incorrect. They've come to a beginning of an understanding of something new that they can then explore. And I think that's kind of what I try to bring to my nonfiction food writing, certainly.
I find that, in general, when writing about food, that adds this limitation because it makes food into a metaphor. That in no way am I actually ever writing about the food itself. It's always through these other kind of veils. And that is a limitation in the sense that actually eating the food, right, that experience of taking something into your body, digesting it, feeling it go through you, feeling nourished by it, that seems to transcend some boundaries for people when it comes to just in general maybe openness. So rather than food being a vehicle for completely understanding another culture, it's a piece of a pie. It's still an important piece of the pie because it does something so physical and so tangible that I feel like writing just can't quite approach. And so, in some ways, to try and answer your question, I feel like there are limitations, but everything has limitations and everything has affordances in almost equal weight. And so it is a kind of need to combine and balance a lot of different aspects in order to get a fuller understanding. But to only have food or to only have food writing does feel limited because it's only a slice.
I think that there is a danger that I find that of exoticizing in food writing, so that even though I think what I'm doing is I'm bringing these stories to the fore, I feel like, this is what I see as the limit. Am I just reiterating this narrative that here is an immigrant cooking the food of his or her culture and, touching on some of the same issues we've been talking about tonight? Just is that the only story we want to hear? Do we only want to go to an immigrant restaurant if they're cooking their own food that we think is authentic to their country of origin? And so I feel every time I write these stories, I really have to think about how do I talk about them. And I look back on my early food writing and I see all these mistakes I made. I remember the first time I ate land snails at a Nigerian restaurant. And I feel like I wrote about, I noted that the people at my table were slightly nonplussed by the size of the snail. And I even think something like that, the truth is that for another culture, this is something that's completely ordinary. And so to write about it as if it's something exotic is wrong. And that can be really hard to do when you're writing about food that people are unfamiliar with and don't know about, and you want to make it sound special, but you don't want to make it sound too special. So I don't know if that's a limit or just a problem of food writing. And I don't know if that answers the question.
How do you guys feel about MSG?
Love it.
Love it.
I think I can recuse myself from this one, right? It's not really a big Indian food thing, is it? No.
My mother uses it.
I use Kewpie mayonnaise, which has MSG in it. That's my mayo, so I'd say yes.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. So my mom and dad, when I was younger, also very rarely cooked. I don't think either of them really enjoy cooking, especially my mom. And a lot of the exposure I had to any kind of their food growing up was either when they made food that they ate when they were younger and had very little money, like, fried pig skin, and they would eat it and they would say like, oh, this is kind of bad actually. Or when they would take me to actual restaurants, and the people in those restaurants would make the food for us, and they would tell me about how they had eaten that when they were younger. So I've been thinking a lot about how my own access to, homeland food has been through the space of a restaurant, and how even though if we're getting technical, my home food is like, Costco pizzas, but for some reason Chinese food still has like an element of nostalgia and separation to it. So I'm wondering what y'all think about restaurants and home spaces and their places in how we think about homeland and diaspora.
This is a lot of what my book is about, because my parents are from Mauritius, so Mauritian food is quite different from Indian food in many ways. So by looking at me, you'd think that, and knowing that I wrote a food book, you'd think that I learned about Indian food, at my mother's side, watching her. It's not the case. I learned about it through a succession of like terrible or good or really good restaurants. And then through books. And to me, that it helped me to sort of, the food thing actually formed the basis of why I was so skeptical of so much South Asian writing that I felt pressured to respond to. And like these, which my parents read. They would read the sort of what I call diasporic book of the month club book. And they'd respond to it, even though it had nothing to do with their own backgrounds, which frustrated me so much when I was younger. Because it wasn't our story, it wasn't my story. And then when I, became a super low-level award-winning Canadian writer and realized that, oh my God, I have to write one of these if I want a career. Like that's literally, that is door 1, 2, and 3. It became really troubling to me. And Homeland and nostalgia for Homeland had just never been one of the major parts of the way that I thought about myself, or that I thought about my family, or that I thought about my future. And I think having these sort of, unique, not so unique childhoods where we have a very different relationship to food than what we're expected to in a diasporic household is actually an encouraging and interesting thing. That it's proof positive that these stories have to be different. We have to tell different stories. I think Costco pizza and fried pig skin and an occasional interesting restaurant meal is a more interesting is a more interesting story than having a mom who's a great cook.
So, like I had mentioned before, my parents adapted to a Western kitchen when they made their food, and so I actually grew up knowing that there were certain dishes that we should definitely order at restaurants, because only a restaurant and their kind of kitchen that they had designed would possibly be able to make, pea shoots as tender as they could possibly be. If you made it at home, they would be, really gristly. So we could only go to a restaurant if we wanted to order that dish. So I think that, using a restaurant as a way to access homeland, as a way to access nostalgia, feels to me in some ways like a response to growing up or living in a space that was not built for you, that was not built for you in mind. And the existence of those restaurants is proof that you can build and design your own space to work for you, even inside of a space that is not for you. So I think it's actually really a lovely memory for me and my parents to go to restaurants to get the food that really reminded them of home.
I'm just thinking of this saying. I think it was a Chinese writer who said, "What is patriotism but the love of the food one ate as a child?" So it's interesting when it's a confused story, what you ate as a child, when it's coming from so many different places, but an interesting one, as we've said here. And I do think that for me, the best kind of restaurant is the one that makes you nostalgic for a childhood you never had. So it could be a restaurant from a completely different culture, and you wish that that chef was your mom. So yeah, I think that this is the gift of the restaurants, that you can go to a place and really be taken somewhere else. And how wonderful, again, that we live in New York, where you can go to a restaurant that every single cuisine is represented, and you can have all of these amazing experiences. That's what I love about my work.
Well, I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. So even though the discussion is ended, we'll be milling around and you can meet with the authors. We have the Lillian's and Naben's books for sale. So please buy them. Read Ligaya's column as much as you can. I guarantee you'll fall in love with it. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop. And thank you to our panelists.